Hello, hello, hello. It is December 4th, 2024. It's getting cold. My name is Calden Dasimpa. I'm your host here at Metropolis, Montreal's favorite news talk show. That's not the slogan. I forgot the slogan, but that's what it's going to be for today. Today's guest, a returning face, Felix Fuchs.
Yes, correct.
Felix Fuchs, like books.
Kind of, yeah.
I don't know why I pronounce
Hard to pronounce. That's my
Fuchs.
icebreaker with students. I tell them I get it. It's just stay away from the name. If you're uncomfortable, like just go with Felix.
Professor F.
Professor F. Yeah, I haven't tried that one yet, but it could work.
That's like a 50s thing. Mr. F. Hey. Felix, I have you on today because there's quite a bit of labor news, labor activity happening in and around Montreal. Some of it is not just uniquely in Montreal, but just Montreal just happens to be affected by this. Last time I had you on, you came to speak about Le Front Commun, the absolutely massive strikes that were happening here in the public sector last December. Almost a year ago now.
Yes,
it? Yeah. Wow, look at that. And so I have you back on to talk about just a range of things. We're going to talk about the Canada Post strikes, CUPW strikes, how people are reacting to that, your thoughts on it. We're going to be talking about the what's the word I'm looking for? Anglo institutions, how Legault is treating them or mistreating them rather.
Yeah. Where do you want to start? I don't know, returning guest. If people remember, I'm involved or was involved in the Common Front struggle through my work as a CEGEP professor. I work at Dawson. I work also at Concordia and McGill, basically wherever I can get a contract. And at Dawson in particular, unlike some of the other places, very strongly unionized. Concordia too for the course lecturers to a certain degree, but the Dawson union, the CEGEP unions in general are very strong when it comes to organizing, striking, putting pressure on the government. And that's sort of the latest thing of that was the big strike that you just mentioned last year. And the latest on that is that since then...
give us some updates.
Last time we were talking was probably March, so just after the strikes. Things hadn't been quite wrapped up yet. They were finalizing the final offers, the final collective agreements, drawing them up. And since then, they've officially been endorsed, they've been signed and everything. And the first material benefits are felt by CEGEP teachers. One big achievement of the Common Front strike was that they asked for more support for early career teachers, such as myself. And so I felt the back pay and the pay bump that was one of the results of the strike. So that's been great to see. And just today we get an email from our union, FNEC, the sort of larger body above the Dawson Teachers Union, one of the organizations within the CSN, which is our overarching union organization. They're asking for feedback on how members felt the organizing went, the strike went, the negotiations went, a kind of nego feedback, which is of course useful if as a labor union, as a larger union movement, you're trying to create a kind of muscle memory, if you will, for the union movement as a whole.
Next time they'll know how the members felt about this certain range of tactics.
And I mean, knock on wood, I'll be around 5 years from now, and I'll be able to say I was there 5 years ago for the last strike.
Shaking your fist, you're like, let me tell you, kids, what the Front Commun was like. No, thank you for the update. It's
of course. Yeah.
I think sometimes it's easy if you're just watching just news and you get the big moments, right? But then what's lost and what's lost in the story, and it's harder to sell as a story. It's just the negotiations, right? It's the backroom dealings, the actual getting the contracts out. That part's a little less.
Which is a general issue, right?
A
general issue with the reporting on these kind of things, because, for example, to kind of lead from that gradually to the CUPW strike. What you get is it makes it on the media when the strike happens.
Right.
And then oftentimes the kind of conversation you have is one that's framed in the media but also framed just in public, in the public sphere, as a discussion of like, well, why are they going on strike now? Why doing this? Why would you do this during Christmas when it really like hurts people? And what completely like gets ignored in that kind of narrative is that, or maybe mentioned in a sort of like on a side note, that the negotiations have actually been going on for a much longer time.
Right. Yeah. A strike
Like,
is never the first thing.
exactly. A strike is a gradual process, or by the time that you get to the strike, it's a process of escalation, which means that like it starts with negotiations. When the negotiations run into trouble, into issues where the employer blows you off, where the employer doesn't see eye to eye with you on certain issues, says, well, we're not even going to talk about that because that's not, like, first you have to make concessions here or there. Like, if that kind of like stalls, then you see a gradual effort where, for example, unions will go back to their membership and say, well, those are some of the things that they say we're absolutely not going to talk about. Is this something that you're willing to kind of like make a cut on? This is something that's like a great thing with the CSN and the union organizing experience in the Common Front, that like they're actually very, oftentimes you get unions that are kind of like doing things top down, and then you get the backroom deals and the agreements with the employer that are oftentimes not what membership wants. In the case of the CSN, there's a lot of feedback where like they bring back their negotiations to the different, to the nursing union, to the teachers union, and they will bring it back to their individual subsets, like to our locale, to the Dawson's Teachers Union, and say, this is how negotiations have been going. Like, is there something that you are willing to make a compromise on? And then they bring that back to the government. So that's a long, drawn-out process.
Of course, yeah.
For the strike with the Common Front, they essentially let the collective agreement lapse. Like, it went beyond the term of the current collective agreement that I think ran out in, don't quote me on this entirely. I mean, I guess I'm making it quotable, but I think I think it was either 2022 or 2023, but we were vastly beyond like the mandate of the collective agreement. And that's, of course, I mean, that's not on the union, that's on the employer. Like, if you're not willing to make compromises, if you let it get to that point, then you're already looking at like essentially a failure on management's part that's a year long or longer of like finding a way to talk to your employees and settle on something that's good for them, that's good for you ultimately. That is when then talk of strike comes in. The way that it worked in the Common Front was a very careful process that considered impact on students, impact on parents, of saying like, well, we could just go on an unlimited general strike right now, but we're not going to do that out of concern for our students, out of concern for their parents, out of concern for society. Because if you go on strike in a sector like education or healthcare, everything grinds to a halt, right? That's like usually the leverage that especially teachers have, that like if you go on strike, parents very quickly realize that, well, turns out I need a place that like keeps my kids off the street for like a couple of hours during the day while I'm at work. That like was considered. We went on a warning strike. I don't know if you exactly call it that here, where I come from, Germany originally. It's called a warning strike, which is when the union kind of just says, well, this is what we could do on a larger scale if you're not going back to the table. And then, of course, like it continues from there. So it's a process of escalation where by the time we got to the threat, even, we never went on a general unlimited strike, which would have been the largest labor strike in Canadian history. It never got to that point because we went on several shorter strikes, several like 1-day strike, 3-day strike, a week-long strike. That ultimately did the trick. A lot of other things beyond that you can do to escalate is during one of the strikes, we, in lieu of holding a picket line, member unions would sign up for a kind of like hush-hush protest, where every union kind of knew like where we had to meet up. But then like you have a kind of classic like organizing principle of like large-scale disruption, where you knew like only the people that were like leading your union knew kind of like where you had to go. And none of the members, like we didn't know like where we're headed. And it coalesced on the World Trade Center in downtown Montreal, which we occupied for like a short period of time, then peacefully left again. But as a way to kind of like show that we can get together,
We're
we can
organized,
have these massive protests, or like large demonstrations leading through the city, passing by the hospital, for example. And we later found out at one of the union meetings, this is a great moment too of kind of inter-union and locale solidarity. we were told that, like, hey, this is something that the nursing unions wanted to share with the educators and everyone else who was in that protest, that, like, you couldn't see us from the big, like, news center. What's the one downtown? I forget what it's called. One of the super hospitals downtown. Like, we were marching by there. I think it's the Schirm, And
right
they were
on
saying,
the
like, you couldn't see us through, like, the windows of the Schirm, but we were, like, standing in there cheering because, like, we knew that, like, we're part of this, and you're here for us, and we're here for you. So that's a great way in which unions can kind of, like, activate membership and kind of, like, show society too, right? That this is something that actually, it's not just about, like, a small portion of the population. This is actually services that we're trying to improve. It's not just about our pay. It's also about the services that we provide to society. If you're creating better working conditions for us through pay, through other concessions from the employer, which is ultimately the government, we can do the work better, which is a major concern right now. If you're looking at healthcare, if you're looking at education, they're coming at it from the other side. They're coming at it from a perspective of austerity, where they're making cuts, saying, like, well, in order to make it work better, we have to, like, make cuts in, like, how we're spending money. We have to centralize more, for example, in the healthcare system. Just now with the new Santé Québec institution, that's the wrong way to go about it. That's basically, like, usually, like, leads to, like, throwing workers under the bus, throwing employees under the bus, throwing society on the bus. If we go back to Cup W is, like, it's essentially, like, what's going on right now. What the strike is over is, it's essentially a manufactured crisis.
Just to give a little context, the Cup W strike is the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. At Canada Post, they've been, like, striking for a few weeks now.
Yeah. And if you're talking about something like mail services, if you're talking about the postal service, you're talking about a public institution. The way that it's oftentimes approached, the way that it's presented in public discourse, the way that it's presented, or the way that people understand it, is they're oftentimes told that, oh, we're running a deficit, therefore we need to make cuts.
Right.
That kind of, like, makes sense to people, but it's, like, a weird kind of way in which we've kind of, like, gaslit society and all of us into just thinking that everything needs to be run like a business. You certainly don't run your home like a business. Oftentimes, like, families, like, I think Quebec has the highest per capita, debt that people take on in order to live their lives the way they want to, right? That's, like, if you want a balanced budget, that's not exactly how you run a family. That's not exactly how you think about your education. You think about it as a kind of investment in you. That is how a society should be run. If you run a society as a business that needs to be, like, at zero, or ideally, like, in a plus for the shareholders, society is not a business. Society is an institution. Society is us.
Right.
So if you approach it, however, as a business, then it gives you kind of leverage to say that, well, as a business, we're not profitable, therefore we need to kind of make cuts. But that is what I mean when I say that it's artificial, that it's a crisis that's created by management. Because if you look at the numbers, if you look at what postal workers are saying, I happen to have a couple of friends and acquaintances that are postal workers. They're all saying, like, what we're providing is a service, right? Like, if the money is not there, that has to do with mismanagement. That has to do with the fact that, for example, when they already knew that we're risking a budget shortfall, they started to kind of, like, keep maintaining cars that are not being used, keep doing new renovations. And then, of course, like, that way you kind of, like, create a larger deficit than you would need to have.
Right.
And then you can blame it on the workers. You can say, well, what's actually causing the cost now, what's causing the deficit is exactly the fact that
greedy
people
workers.
are the greedy workers that are asking like for more money. Never mind, exactly, in quotation marks,
greedy,
never mind that,
not
of
my
course,
words.
like, oftentimes these demands that are, like, even in the media, again, like, appear as, like, oh, entitled workers asking for more money when they're already making so much money, is usually at this point in time just asking for adjustment of inflation. If you look at the Common Front, they initially offered us 9%, which was not nowhere near even catching up with inflation. I think we ended up getting something like 17.4%. That's basically just like maintaining our standard of living. That's not like it's kind of presented as a pay raise. It's presented as more money. It's not really more money in the way that everything else gets more expensive in society.
Right,
so we're
exactly.
basically just barely keeping
If
up.
your wages go up $2 an hour, but then everything else goes up like $10, and it's like, what good is that raise? Right?
Exactly.
It's effectively
Yeah.
a loss. It's effectively
And
a
that was
pay
like
cut.
at a certain point when they were called out on that in the negotiations, they kind of like started to kind of frame it as like, well, yeah, but everyone's taking those hits now, so you got to take one for the team. But that's of course not how governments work, right? If you take one for the team, they'll make you take two next time.
Yeah. Thanks for taking that for the team. Won't you take a couple
Exactly.
more cuts?
Do it for the students.
Yeah,
That's something
yeah,
that educators love hearing when it's taking on more work, taking on a bigger workload. Right? Nothing feels greater to an educator than being kind of like pressured or kind of like when they're pulling on your heartstrings to say like, don't you feel bad for the students if their education gets worse? Well, of course, but like if you make it harder on the profs, all you're gonna get is like burnout. All you're gonna get is people leaving the field before they ever like build a career, which is part of like what the high school system.
It affects their capacity as a teacher, right? As well,
Which is that's for example why the high school teachers went on strike at the same time. They went on an unlimited general strike. They escalated more quickly than the Common Front because they're feeling the squeeze more. Right. The crisis in the high school system is already apparent to the point where like they have to like ask. I think in some cases, like parents or unqualified personnel come in to fill in for classes that they simply don't have the staff for anymore. Why don't they have the staff? Because they've disinvested in education, they've disinvested in public services, and it creates that kind of crisis which then usually gives management or the government leverage to say, well, it's already working bad, so we need to make changes. Here are solutions. Never mind that those solutions are usually a little bit better for the government's bottom line than they are for society or for workers.
Yeah, I see some interesting kind of like, I mean, they're kind of these tired talking points, right? You got into it a little bit about, I find it interesting when people talk about these strikes and there's a sense of like, why aren't you doing the kind of self-sacrifice thing? You know, why aren't you letting these companies just completely use you, right? It's interesting because it's like you have that thing of like we're talking about this, right? This idea of this greedy worker, this worker who's like really cares more about their pay than anything else, and I find it's such a such a pervasive idea about workers, right? Because specifically taking this back to the postal workers strike, right? And I think there's also historically, right, the postal workers is this like incredibly like important factor of like securing rights for Canadian society, right?
One of the strongest unions.
Exactly, one of the more stronger ones, one of the more radical ones, right? Like before, I remember in the last episode where you talked about the utility of the frontcomer and like how it's not just this thing of like increasing pay. Of course, it is just like to live in society, you need to be able to like afford to live in society. It's also this thing about improving services, right? I really enjoy it's this thing of improving services, improving just like the quality of government services, of public services to the general public. And I think there's this kind of, I guess, the similarity I see in the CUPW, at least in their history, right? Because one of the big wins of the CUPW was that they were able to secure maternity rights, right? And I think that was like without them, who knows how long it would have taken.
And one of the historic wins of the Common Front, like in the 70s, was minimum wage in Quebec. So you can tell, like, there are ways in which they're actually like it's about them, it's about their workplaces, but it's also about so much more, which is why you, for example, in the Common Front, you see nurses and teachers work together, and support staff as well, professionals across the board in these in these sectors of education and healthcare, more broadly speaking. And that's, of course, something very important that unions do more generally as a service to society. Like we oftentimes think about unions as a sort of like separate entity. Unions are us, right? That's like part of the reason why people oftentimes have a sort of negative view of unions, or even if they're in unionized workplaces. Sometimes maybe because the union has become demobilized. I've talked to people that are, for example, in veterinary healthcare, in the healthcare sector, that feel like, well, what's the union doing for me? Well, if you feel like the union's not doing anything for you, that's a union problem, but in terms of like they need to mobilize their members, but it's also you problem that you need to realize that you can actually like get involved in the union. The union is not a thing that does something for you. The union is a tool that you can use. And that's like the big like advantage of having something like the Common Front struggle, having something like the CUPW going on strike very visibly in society and pushing along that like line of trying to improve society and getting better services for everyone. That becomes actually a great way to educating society and workers, not just unionized workers, that if you struggle, you can win. If you don't struggle, you can't win,
Yeah.
right? Then
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
just gonna see like your rights gradually go away. If, for example, Cup W, one of the things that is a big talking or a sticking point in the negotiations is the employer wants to be able to deliver packages on weekends, and they want to be able to hire contractor or contract personnel to do that on an individual contract, basically turning it into a similar sort of like change that you see with organizations like Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, that are basically making things more precarious. That putting
Right.
the taking the rights
Gig work.
away and putting putting all the pressure on you as a gig worker.
Right.
And the union, on the other hand, says, well, we already have the personnel. Just pay them overtime as you normally would, like if it goes past your normal workday. So we have a way of doing that. We could pay people. We have everything in place in order to be able to do it. You just don't want to do it.
Yeah, you have the people with the experience, the people who know how to do this, and all that will take is just paying them overtime, right, to work weekends, and that's where they're kind of.
And what it tells you is that like what they're actually after on the management level is they're trying to make it easier to kind of like control, because if you start hiring contract workers, then of course like they're not going to have, you can play them out against the unionized employees. Or even if they are unionized, like it's going to create a kind of two-tier system where you have some people who don't have quite the same like safety, who don't quite have the same standing in the workplace. That creates bad blood. That ultimately undermines the union, and that's exactly why they're asking for stuff like that, because obviously it's cheaper for them to kind of like do it that way, because they don't have to worry about like addressing union concerns or offering like overtime pay. But on the other hand, it has always that kind of double benefit from at the same time like chipping away the ability of the union to apply pressure to the employee.
No, it's interesting seeing that kind of model wanting to be applied to Canada Post, because you see those kinds of like, I mean that kind of work is I mean that's how these kind of companies, right, like Airbnb, Uber, they're just kind of they offer services that are already offered by society, right, like either a taxi service, either hotels, but then instead of having to like pay into the, I don't know, like what you would call maybe like institutional costs, right, of like having like HR, of having kind of to manage this kind of people and giving them benefits as well, right? Because these are all
and it of course puts all that pressure on workers. It says, well, now there's no more HR. You're responsible for your contract. There's no health insurance.
How much money you make is
for insurance.
like that's dependent on how much you hustle, right? There's the idea of like it's purely about like individual merit, and like if you don't make money, that's completely your fault. And
if you feel underpaid, work more. Right. That's like, I mean, that's perverse that we're like having that kind of conversation. I mean, add to that like organizations like Uber and Airbnb, like there used to be this old sort of like joke or understanding in the way that like unionists, anyone on the left like would be dismissed in places like the United States, of saying like, well, go on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and then you're going to have to share all your property with everyone else. Well, now the great irony is that we live in a day and age where if you want to own a home, you have to rent out parts of it. If you want to own a new car, you have to kind of like go through the grind and share it with other people. Well, great, right? That's sort of like, it shows you kind of like where what is happening in the way that a lot of these things that we took for granted are gradually kind of being built back, and for no other reason than that it facilitates wealth accumulation. It makes it easier to make profit. But whenever you're asking, or whenever governments say we need to balance the budget in order to improve business climate, in order to create more jobs, in order to draw people here, better business climate usually means there's a storm coming for union membership. There's a storm coming for everyone who's not like already in the middle of society and who can benefit from tax cuts and these other things that governments usually like promising.
Talk about this business angle. I mean, so this is something I wanted to bring up, where like with this kind of Canada Post strike, you see a lot of local media like CTV, CBC, City News talking about like, this is like something you often see, right? Where they're like, what about small business? Why these Canada Post workers, they're hurting small businesses, right? And like, of course, small businesses, many times if you're delivering kind of like goods, you have to rely on Canada Post or potentially other couriers. And I find that framing so, I don't know, interesting, because it's like, it's pretty tired. It's, I guess, to be expected, and it's a very limiting kind of a viewpoint, right? Because it's like nowhere in that kind of discussion do we hear the things like we're talking about, or the
Yeah.
things that you're talking
Yeah,
about kind of
or
like
the things that Cup W, for example, offers. Or some of the things that they offered as a concession, they said, well, there's other things we could offer. We could offer banking services. We already have the infrastructure for that. In rural communities, in remote areas, we could offer a check-in service on, like, if you want to check on your parent, they're a little bit older, you need someone to kind of like make sure they're okay. You haven't heard from them in a couple of days. They're not answering the phone. Postal workers already going to be there to kind of like drop
they're already
off,
in the neighborhood.
And it's very different than like calling the cops to do that check-in, where like that usually comes with a whole other host of risks of sending someone in who's not a trained social worker, but who also has a gun. Postal worker is not a trained social worker either, but they're not going to shoot.
And they don't have guns, from what I understand.
Exactly.
But
to maybe remote areas, I don't know, like if you're at risk of like wolves or bears. But
it's true. That's true. I love the image of that.
That's neither here nor there, right? But like, so that's a different way of having a conversation. If you frame it immediately in terms of small businesses, of course, small businesses, medium businesses, they're important. They're a major employer across Canadian society, in the United States, like across like many countries. Like small businesses, if you look at like these comparisons of like how politicians talk about it, you can kind of like, they're all saying like they're the backbone of the economy, they're the backbone of the economy over and over again. Sure, fair, that has to be acknowledged, but then like don't make them pay the bill on the part of the employer. If you know that that's the issue, make concession to your employees or find ways of accommodating them. Instead, it's usually weaponized, and if you frame it in terms of like, this is bad for business, this is bad for small businesses, medium businesses, you're already kind of putting it back away from the focus from the fact that something like Canada Post can't be run like a business because it's a public service.
Right.
You're putting it back into that framework of it is bad for businesses, therefore we need to think about it as a business. That's kind of pulling things back onto the territory of management. That's the kind of like conversation that they want to have.
That's interesting.
And
I guess it'd be kind of like if people start talking about like roads, right? It's like, oh, like the quality of the roads are bad and that's bad for business, but like people don't like really kind of think about that sense, right? People don't think of roads and are as a they think of roads as a service, of course, as a thing that's like, almost like a necessity, just infrastructure, right?
And I mean, like, don't get started on like roads in Quebec. I think everybody has to say something on that. I biked here. And I mean, that was a bumpy ride to say the least, on the bike.
When he got here, he was like frazzled.
I completely sweated through just from like that mountainous trek through the potholes.
When I used to do Uber Eats, right? And when I bought a bike, I made sure to buy like a mountain bike, like a bike with like big tires, because otherwise, like if you're on like those sleek like European bikes with the thin tires, you're done for.
No, you're that doesn't work. And I mean, that's too something, right? Like we should actually invest in that kind of infrastructure. Why? Because it's good for society, but it also is good for business. Like if you frame it like that, you're trying to improve society, then of course businesses are going to benefit from that as well. Usually because businesses, especially small and medium businesses, rely on what's called social reproduction, which is they rely on the kind of labor that is largely done by women, that is largely devalued in society. They rely on the fact that someone's going to, for free, raise and educate these workers for them, that someone is for free going to take care of their room and board.
Right.
That is the parents, that is the families, that is oftentimes the women in the lives of workers. Businesses rely on that. If you're talking about improving services, you're talking about actually like making social reproduction in society run more smoothly, which is good for businesses. It's entirely about framing, and particularly insidious when you look at Cup W, for example. As I mentioned before, I happen to know a couple of postal workers. One of them posted something about the fact that one of the senior management at Canada Post also has a stake and sits on the board of Intelcom, or one of those packaging companies. Big surprise, right? Dum, dum, dum. And
that was great.
Yeah. And I read that and I was like, okay, no surprise here.
Yeah.
But as soon as you put it in the context of the strike, well, okay, like huge impact on Canadian society in the lead up to Christmas and the holidays and everything. But on the other hand, they're very consciously like selling it at Intelcom as like, we're going to give rebates to small businesses, sign up for a whole year.
Right.
And that's actually like one of the people that are in the management, like facilitating a further decrease in business for Canada Post by pressuring or using the pressure of the current strike to use companies like Intelcom to actually inflate their own take on of the package volume, which will ultimately in the long run undercut Canada Post. They might not, this might be long-term thinking. They might not win what they want to win at the management level in the Cup W negotiations right now. They will probably a couple of years from now if they increase the pressure on Canada Post by undermining the kind of business that Canada Post has.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I mean, to me, it sounds like such a conflict of interest, right? It's like here you are in Canada Post, sort of like, I don't know, throwing what's the term? Like a wrench in the works, making it run a little worse, and then here you are also working for the competitors and just offering like, oh, aren't you annoyed with their services? You should just use our services instead.
Yeah. And the interesting thing to me there is to kind of look at that in a broader context of what the larger project behind this is. Because yes, it's like there's a Cup W strike, it's about that. You can look at the common front and the broader context, the fact that you have the Cup W strike this year, the fact that you have dock workers go on strike, the fact that you have Amazon workplaces starting to unionize in Canada. That's something that is a result of the common front strikes. If workers see that they can win, there is going to be a ripple effect. If there's an increase for like the majority of unions or public sector unions, then there is going to be a ripple effect for other public institutions like the Postal Service. There's going to be a ripple effect for other workplaces, private employers, that if the public sector pays better, they have to kind of move along with that. If they don't,
it just raises the bar.
Then they can lower their pay, right? So there's actually a kind of ripple effect that union organizing has in this way. And this is very important. It tells you something about the strategic effort to undermine that. Because if you look at, for example, upcoming election in 2 years, I think in Quebec, next year, if not earlier at the federal level, parties like the Conservative Party have right-to-work legislation in their party platform.
What is right-to-work legislation?
Right-to-work legislation sounds great on paper, right? That's something like everybody, I want to have the right to have a job. And
who's trying to make me not work?
Exactly. It kind of implies well, who's against that? Like, are people who don't want you to have the right to do the job that you want to do? That's not quite what it is. Right-to-work legislation means that if you're in a unionized workplace, you cannot be forced to pay union dues. At the moment, you may not, union organizing, for example, it is usually limited to a certain mobilized segment of your population. If you have a general assembly, not everyone who works in a certain workplace is going to come. It's usually the people who have more of a say, who are either positively or negatively interested in the union work. Not everybody is going to come. Not everybody has the brain space to come, which, fair enough. But everyone who works in a certain workplace, like Dawson College, has to pay union fees. That means if right-to-work legislation gets passed, you make it optional. Which means that anyone who does not support unions ideologically, anyone who just feels the squeeze and says I can't afford to not get those
I want to hold on
extra
to my
couple
dues.
of bucks, exactly. That limits the amount of union power because the amount of money that they can accumulate shrinks, which means that in the next strike they won't be able to offer their members strike pay. They won't be able to actually organize a strike. They might have to make cuts in terms of the union executive. People might have to take on more work at the executive level or in the union councils, which means you make the unions work less efficiently, which, of course, in the long run is then easier to kind of deal with from the employer, from the government perspective, if you're trying to push through these things that are not good for the workers in these institutions, but they're sold as you got to make some admissions or some concessions in this kind of austerity climate.
Right.
And that's where you start to see that it fits into a broader context. It's about unions, but it's also about everything else in society. It's about reproductive rights. It's about immigration. It's about education and healthcare. All of these services that are not working well. Big discussion in society right now, in Canadian society, is how do we make them run better? How do we make public health in Quebec function more efficiently? Well, the answer, if you ask anyone who works in healthcare or if you ask anyone who works in education, is hire more people in order to decrease class sizes, in order to take workload off of the shoulders of nursing staff, of doctors, of teachers. What do governments usually ask for? They ask for the opposite. They say we need to solve this at the administrative level, and we need to, for example, create an entire new institution that centralizes healthcare in Quebec, which is just going to put more strain on a system that's already not working well. And this is sort of like there you're starting to see that all of these things are actually connected to a broader political project, which is about making society more efficient for business, improving business climate. And as I said before, that usually means there's a storm coming for everyone else in terms of livability, in terms of affordability, in terms of living quality in a given society. Noam Chomsky, for example, talks about this in his movie, or it's a kind of like long-form interview that is movie length, called The Requiem for the American Dream, which basically talks about like how union power in a country like the United States has been built back since the Reagan era and undermined strategically by governments and politicians. What it leads to is a society where certain services don't work that well anymore. You make cuts in austerity budgets. They usually don't come after the military. They usually don't come after their own salaries. Instead, they go after like public services. They say
It's the thing about framing, right? Like they talk about like big government, but there's sections of big government that they will never touch.
And it becomes usually a kind of like scolding thing, like of like workers have been entitled, society has been entitled. All of these things that we should understand as rights are framed as privileges, and then as soon as you frame them as a privilege rather than a right, you can take them away because you can say, well, tough times, so you got to make some cuts, you got to make some concessions. What happens with that is if you start applying that in one sector, if you, for example, put more pressure on the healthcare system by by kind of like defunding already in such a way that a lot more people have to go through the ER, which breaks the back of emergency room services, which then puts more pressure on the healthcare system and becomes a kind of like negative feedback loop in that way. That's part of the larger project, because if you make these services, if you increase the pressure, if you make them work less well, what is ultimately going to happen is that then people are going to call for changes. And then you're going to be able to say, well, do I have a solution top down for you for the healthcare system? We privatize it. We run it like a business even more than we're already doing. It will work better. Never mind that it will work better for the people who can afford the services. It will work even worse than it does right now for anyone else, which is the majority of society, of course. That's how you do it in healthcare. That's how they're trying to do it in the education system. And I think that's kind of like where we can maybe wrap it up, because like we're drawing a line here from CUPW and the Common Front strike to essentially like looking at like other ways in which these austerity budgets are kind of like cutting into public services, which is ultimately where was I going with this? For example, other budget cuts, right? Like not only are they centralizing the healthcare system, but they're actually also making cuts by just literally cutting down on spending. I think 1.5 billion in the healthcare sector. Same in education. In education, it's felt a little bit less in Quebec society, I think, because they're mainly coming after McGill Concordia through caps on enrollment at the federal level, where they're essentially throwing international students under the bus and blaming them for the housing crisis. In Quebec, they're doing it with Anglophone institutions, which are the low-hanging fruit. But you better believe that once
shedding too many
kind of
tears for Anglo institutions.
Yeah, if you at Dawson, for example, they cut the operating budget, which means that immediately, like, they're decrepit buildings. Like in the summer, I had to teach in like 40-degree rooms where they put in, like, as a temporary solution, literal fans that they just purchased across the street from Canadian Tire. That like is the level of like destitution in these places, where they're cutting the operating budgets. The library had to stop buying books at Dawson. They instituted a hiring freeze for anyone who's not student-facing personnel. That means that these institutions are going to work less. They're going to work less well for Anglophone students. They're going to work less well for Allophone students. They're going to work less well for Francophone students who come to places like Dawson because they want to improve their English, because they want to be competitive in the market. And what you're starting to see then is that they're kind of gradually destroying these services, because then you can get rid of them completely. You can integrate them through, which is already happening through Bill 96, through Law 14, into the Francophone CEGEP system. As soon as they've done that, they're going to come after the CEGEP system as a whole. If Legault had his will, he would have gotten rid of the CEGEP system a long time ago. He says, I think I mentioned that last time that we spoke, he once famously said, CEGEP is a great way to learn how to smoke weed. Right. So that like tells you something about like the attitude of governments towards these services. They don't see them as a service to the public. They see them as a a kind of like dead weight
Right.
to what they're trying to do, which is improve business climate, run society as a business.
No, it's interesting because in like 2012, we saw with the student strikes, right? There's like the Charest government, the liberals at the time, were trying to do that thing of like cutting the budget for education, and they did that by was it like it was like instituting like a 30% raise on tuition. But that's like the mistake of them on that part was like it was too big a bite, right?
Yeah.
It was just too large a change, and
You
people
came
were able
after
to-
everyone, right?
Exactly,
And
yeah,
if you're aiming for the king, you better not miss,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. But now here with
now
the-
they're realizing if it's divide and conquer, if you cut it into smaller bites, you can come after these parts of the sector.
Yeah, just a
that are
thousand
not-
little cuts.
Exactly,
That's
that
it.
are not be able to going to put up that kind of fight, that are not going to have that kind of like broad social support, and then eventually they're going to come after it for everyone.
Yeah.
But in that way, where you make the services work less well, you defund them, you restructure them until you can basically get rid of them. Problem solved from the sort of business government perspective.
Right, from that certain mindset. Yeah,
And that's exactly what we kind of have to fight back against, what
Mm-hmm.
unions are already doing. And this is going to be a kind of like concerted effort where unions play a major role, but it's going to be something that society as a whole has to kind of like come to the understanding that we have to actually work together through unions, through other institutions, and fight back against these kind of cuts that are going to come with increasing frequency and that are going to come after your money, your public services, your salaries, your standard of living, essentially.
Nice. Well, I mean, I think that's a great spot for us to end on.
All right.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy to come back if you
Yeah,
guys
of course,
want to talk some more.
of
Next
course.
strike, I'll be back.
Yeah. You planning one?
Not right now, but you never know.
Yeah. Always be ready, I guess. It's good. It's good practice to always be
Yeah.
ready for a strike. Thank you, Felix, again for coming on.
You're very welcome.
Talking about
Thanks for having me.
of course, talking about the utility of strikes, their place in society, not just for the greedy worker that some conservative and right-wing politicians want to sell to you, but in fact that they're doing this to improve, to raise the bar for workers everywhere, right? Because that's I
Yep.
think that's one thing that you're talking about that I think is really stayed with me. So hopefully, we'll see if the CUPW workers can help raise that bar further than what
Yes,
the
and
comment,
all the power
comment
to them.
front. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, and thank you, listener, thank you, watcher, for supporting our show, and take care. Metropolis is a proud in-house production of Community University Television. Our producer is Aude Simon. Our sound technician is Fraser Place. Videography is done by Ahmed Sobi. Our station manager is Hannah Josie. Our executive director, Drew Oyaje. And I'm your host, Colin Datsampa. Thank you so much for listening.